Well, Mr. Carroll, thank you for joining us for a little deep dive into policing, the law, and what it means for cannabis patients. So, a little introduction to Mr. Gaz Carroll for everyone. So, Gaz is a ex-policeman, worked in the West Midlands Police for more than 10 years, and has since transferred his experience into drug expert witness work, and is the founder of Claymore Advisories, who essentially help patients navigate the complexities of the legal sphere, and the legal system demystifies it and helps make sure that they're well represented and the process is well informed. So we've got a lot of wisdom from Gaz that he's very kindly offered to share with us, demystifying a lot of the patient side of the police interactions, the law as it stands, and then also kindly sharing some of the perspectives of the police and his own experience with regards to helping police forces understand cannabis, businesses, and patients as well understand their rights and what they're entitled to as well as part of their new medical prescription. And so, Gaz, I don't know if you want to give a little intro there to any gaps that I've maybe left, and we'll do a little deep dive into yourself and how you found yourself up in the cannabis conversation.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thanks, Chris. It's always good to chat with you, and thanks for that wonderful introduction. You seem to have hit most of the points there, really. So I was a police officer for just over 14 years. Most of my time when I was a serving police officer was involved within the proactive and investigatory roles around drugs, everything related to drugs, whether it's importation, production, cultivation, etc., and then ancillary offences that go hand in hand, such as firearm-related incidents, etc. For the latter 6 years of my time as a police officer, I was what is known as a drug expert witness. Now, a drug expert is an impartial and independent role where we assist the court. So we don't assist the prosecution nor the defence. We assist the court in demystifying the areas around drug supply. As you can imagine, juries made up from 12 random members of the public. They've got varying knowledges and detailed accounts of how drugs work, how they're made, how they're sourced, how they're valued. So a drug expert witness will independently sit in the middle of prosecution and defence, and then tell the jury how everything works, how much the drugs are worth, how they're produced, and importantly, where the person who's been arrested sits in a metaphorical supply chain, if they sit in it at all. So that's a very brief snapshot of a drug expert witness, because it's a type of role that no one has ever heard of. The most common question I get is, what is it you actually do for a living? Because it's much easier just to say a legal consultant, because once you say drug expert witness, you then have to explain the job. I'd love to be an electrician.
Yeah. So over that journey, Gaz, you've obviously seen a lot, and we were talking a little bit about before how with this conversation we want to make sure that we're really helping the police understand the patients and the patients understand the police, and going back to your expertise in crime prevention, hopefully that can lead to a more harmonious relationship between patients receiving cannabinoid medicines and police forces nationally as well.
Yeah.
Would you be able to really kind of, maybe starting there, what is the police's perspective on cannabis in the UK? I'm sure there's a lot of regional variation, which we'll maybe touch upon. But overall, what is it that you think the patient community should primarily know about the police's perspective and approach to cannabis in communities, and addressing that from a law enforcement perspective?
So I think one of the first important points to highlight is that police officers aren't experts in everything to do with crime or everything to do with the law. I'm a drug expert, and there's lots of things about drugs that I don't know. And when the public engages with a typical police officer, whether they're in investigations, whether they're on the streets, if it's a stop and search encounter, it's more to realize they may not have much of a background in medicinal cannabis. Now, police forces in varying depths engage in training on this subject. I mean, it's been legal since 2018, so you would hope that it's part of the curriculum for every new police officer coming through the ranks, but unfortunately it's not. So different forces engage with different people who engage with different practices around medicinal cannabis training. I've trained 300, 400, 500 different police officers and a handful of different police forces about this topic, about how we can better engage with a patient on the streets, how we can understand the situation in a more empathy-based situation, and ultimately split the differences between a medicinal cannabis patient and those who are consuming the drug recreationally and therefore breaking the law. So the trainings to allow police to come up with that divide and understand the differences between both. Now, to flip the coin, in a patient scenario, Chris, me and you both know that there's a lot of patients who are former recreational users, and with that, they will have varying positive and negative engagements with the police.
Sure.
Often, what I've found, I mean, I've been in the medicinal cannabis, pathway, we could call it, for about 7-8 years, even when I was a police officer, helping newly formed companies and organizations engage with law enforcement, giving free legal advice as such, but I'm not a solicitor, but free advice on people who have maybe become into contact with the police. So what I have seen is that a lot of situations the patients could have handled things a lot better. And this is where I imagine we'll come on to later about how we have to really enforce responsible use from a patient who does have medicinal cannabis legally prescribed to them. And understanding that it's not recreational, therefore the consumption habits can't be recreational. Carrying it around in your pocket when you're traveling back and forward in the bus. If it's what you need to get through the day, fantastic. But if it's a week's worth of cannabis, there's no reason to do so. And therefore you're knowingly and purposely putting up obstacles that could result in a negative police encounter. So that's it in a nutshell. But I try to help both sides and know that there's work that needs to be done on both sides to have we could call it a harmonious way forward.
Absolutely. And I was saying this to someone the other day, it'd be nice to see a bit of a homeostasis, harmony to a lot more of these interactions. And I think we both know that sort of comes from the educational side of things and helping bridge some of those maybe misunderstandings that are
Oh, definitely. I mean, look, this is a complex field. It's not an easy pathway to navigate this whole CBPM market. So there's legislations in place, there's requirements for patients in clinics that they have to follow. For a police officer point of view, it's quite simple to say, well, they should know the law around it. Well, there's 500 other laws that they need to store it. And when it comes down to proportionality, how often are they going to come in contact with a cannabis patient? An average police officer, not very often. I'd much, as a citizen, I'd much rather my local cops know, the Road Traffic Act or the Public Order Act more so than what they would have an in-depth knowledge of the medicinal cannabis market. You'd want them to have some knowledge so that patients are dealt with early. But, we have to be real and we have to be proportionate in what we expect.
So maybe as a starting point then for us guys, it would be, I think, useful to sort of set the scene with what are the current legal requirements around prescriptions at the moment. Again, we hear it sort of from the patients in the clinics, and I say the patients, the healthcare professionals and patients, but from your perspective and in your language as well, because I think very different languages between policing and some of the healthcare professionals. How would you describe the current legal requirements and sort of outline those in your own interpretation?
So I mean, originally, going back to the start, from 2018, I feel it was kind of the doors were flung open. Medicinal cannabis was brought into Schedule 2. The Misuse of Drugs Regulations Act 2001, allowing it for private prescription. And there's not a lot of do's and don'ts. I think as long as the cannabis is sourced from an appropriate provider, the patient's got quite a lot of leeway in how they handle the drugs, which is why I think we've came across some issues with patients coming into contact with police. So I feel what I'd like to see going forward is kind of more of a, I suppose, responsible, not enforcement, but responsible education from the clinics given the cannabis to say this is responsible use. This is what we suggest, how you handle your medicine, how you store it, how you carry it, and here's a nice ID card so you can present to police officers. But yeah, the legislation is quite open, and I think it's in favour of the patient. And I think that's maybe why we've come in contact with some issues.
I think it's definitely safe to say the same for the industry as well, around, say, novel foods and some of the retail elements too. So it's like patients have got, and the public are getting cannabis products from all sorts of angles off the internet, from the local health supplement, and now they're finding out they can get it prescribed, and it's been very unclear, as you say, and rightly point out, there wasn't much meat to the bones of the legislative change, and it's sort of, I guess that's what we're figuring out now, is how is best to approach that, and how do we communicate it, how do we build understanding. So it's been quite interesting, I suppose, the downstream implementation.
I mean, if you compare it to Canada, when Canada opened up the market, I mean, they opened it to recreational as well, so it is a lot different. But they had a load of restrictions. How much you're allowed to have in your house, how much you're allowed to have in your person. You can't consume it in company with other people, and you can't have it in a rented house. I'm not saying we should copy all those restrictions, but it shows that different countries put a lot more effort into how they handled bringing it to the market. I feel the UK probably could have put a few more guidelines rather than restrictions, because the last thing we want to do is restrict patients' access to the medicine any further. But certainly guidelines that they need to put out there. And that's my opinion on how it could be probably easier managed going forward.
I guess expanding on that slightly, Gaz, maybe a good time for an example or two of where and what that interaction can look like, and in maybe bad cases, what you've seen go wrong, and where those sort of miscommunications have happened, misunderstandings, or maybe the patient hasn't handled the situation particularly well. Because they're ill, because they're unwell, stressed out.
So
in terms examples that jump to mind.
I mean, I think there's examples where there's been fault at both sides. So firstly, and it's unfortunately it's a fairly commonish one that I do encounter. Chris, again, I'm sure you've had your fair encounter within the cannabis world of those who generally want to push forward for a better future with more access to cannabis medicine and making it more of an easier obtainable drug for people to use who need it. But also there are people who are kind of hell-bent on the whole rec market, recreational use, and I'll even go as far as using the word activisty. I think there's been a lot of examples where I can tell just by reading what's in front of me. And this is when I would get contacted by legal representatives of those persons, because they've been passed my name through the drug community, and I've had to read it and went, the patient should have handled that a lot better. They've either manufactured an encounter with the police by smoking a spliff. They've got a legal prescription, but smoking it in eye shot of a police officer, carrying their whole month's worth of supply in the back pocket, being close proximity to a bus stop full of random members of the public, stuff like that, where I read it and go, why have you done it? And I think the answer is to antagonize. And I feel when those situations really detract from the good work that people do within the cannabis community. So I get a few of those, and I do read it and go, I can't help you in any way, shape, or form. I can't write a report, informing the court of the whole medicinal cannabis market, because the court can clearly see that you've antagonized that situation. On the flip side, there's been situations where patients have, for some reason, had the properties searched by police, whether it's a warrant under the Misuse of Drugs Act, whether it's something entirely different, or whether it's a neighbour complaining about the smell of cannabis and the think of cannabis grow in the cannabis in the property. When they've come into the property and they've seized all the medicine, and I think the way that it's been seized and perhaps the communications that's put forward isn't as sympathetic and professional as what should be put forward. So I think it goes on both sides. Police need to continue the desire for training, but probably increase it. I've reached out to a number of forces. Some are great and they love the free training, whatever I send them. Some don't want to know whatsoever. And that includes the College of Policing. It'd be so easy if it was to come from the top down. But what you find, Chris, is police forces work individually. They all train a little bit differently. They all train to different depths. They train in different specialisms by different people, whether it's a university, whether it's in-house training teams. Sure. And they use different training material. It's not uniformed whatsoever. And it's quite ridiculous that it's not. But also, I think the police need to step up with the training and enforce it as part of a new officer's curriculum as they're going through the training process. So it's a little bit from column A, a little bit from column B that requires improving and just adapting so that it can be better going forward.
This is a bit of a free floaty question for you guys. If totally non-scientific, but if you had to estimate roughly, what sort of proportion of the cases that you see where patients have had a negative interaction and a negative outcome, what proportion of those would you say are sort of like self-inflicted? Is it kind of like a 50-50 where they like a little bit of maybe not discipline, but a bit of responsibility or, I don't know, informed situational awareness?
Yeah.
What sort of proportion do you see being that self-inflicted?
Thankfully, it's not 50-50. I would say most situations and occurrences that are kind of brought to my attention, excuse me, are probably 70% that the police require improvement on education and maybe could have handled better. And 30% it's been a situation that should have been handled better from the patient's point of view.
Okay. Interesting. It sounds like that's both quite preventable then on both sides. It seems like an easy problem to solve theoretically, doesn't it?
Chris, it is. That's the thing. Yeah. And that's what kind of frustrates me. And I think what the difficulty is, look, the medicinal cannabis market is a lucrative market. There's a lot of big players on the scene. There's a lot of big worldwide producers that are operating. They all want to operate individually. And there'll be some cross communications. The chairman of this company will know the chairman of that company and they'll be friends and all that. But they'll all operate a little bit differently. So I think that there's no conjoined effort going forward, which I think probably could help. But also, from the police's point of view, it all comes down to training. But what I do say to people, there's this kind of, I suppose, misrepresentation that cops are out to get the cannabis users, medicinal cannabis users. In my experience, police officers would much rather deal with other drug-related offences. Cannabis comes very, very, very low in the podium poll of stuff that they'd rather get engaged with, unless, of course, it's somebody involved in kilos and they're supplying the illicit market and they're earning loads of money. But when it comes to small amounts, patients versus users, rec market versus the medicinal market, most police officers don't really want to divert a load of time and attention to that world. So it's not an us versus them mentality. I speak with a lot of patients, and yeah, some have the anti-establishment and mindset, but some perfectly reasonable patients and reasonable people do have a bit, the police hate us as cannabis patients. And I thought they really don't. There might be
Yeah.
the odd example that people can watch the video will say, no, I remember a time when this happened and that happened and that happened. Yeah, there was a cop who maybe had a bad day or maybe had a bit of a dislike to you as a person.
Yeah.
The overall majority, I can say in my experience, don't really have that much of a desire, should we say, to start targeting people who have low amounts of cannabis on them, and their patients who may be getting, mislabeled as somebody smoking recreational cannabis.
Yeah. I think what you touched on there about it being quite variable between police forces as well. And I think a lot of people don't realize that there's not one uniform message that goes out to every police officer, trickles all the way down to the policeman instantly. There's I don't know, like a feedback delay almost on the trickle down of information. And again, as you say, 500 different laws to remember. Whilst doing all your work, it's like doctors, like they can't keep up with everything medical that comes out immediately per innovation whilst doing doctoring, and then vice versa. Policemen can't do the policing if they're constantly sitting there with the legislators. So it's
exactly. And that's a great analogy. If you go to ear, nose and throat doctor about an infected toe, I don't think it's going to be much useful. They might have some knowledge in that field, but other than that, you have to go to a specialist. It's likewise with policing. They can't know everything. I certainly didn't. I had areas of policing that I absolutely hated, so I knew the very basics and the very minimal that I had to do. Luckily, the majority of my career was all around drugs, so it was quite of an interesting topic in organised crime that allowed me to really focus on that.
What, if you don't mind me asking, do you think I know what I find interesting about drugs, I guess, is that it's always been like a big taboo in that it's got this dual purpose of great medicines, but then also evil products.
Yeah.
And having done medical research in actually the same compound, doing the same thing, but under different circumstances, interpreted very differently. What do you find, what stands out to you most about drugs as a whole and the way we interpret them, and why you find that intersection so interesting as well? It's
that's a great question. To be honest, I'll go back to when I first, way in the early days when I was just starting out in policing. It was actually accidental why I got involved in drugs. I remember after about a year's service, I had a sergeant in front of me, and it was me and an old colleague, and she needed one person to look at a burglary issue in the Handsworth area of Birmingham. Don't know if you're aware of it. It's a lovely area, but it is a bit problematic. And the other person to look at drugs, and we were literally both stood there in front like this, and she went, Phil, you look at burglaries, and Gaz, you go and look at the drugs. That was it. My kind of destiny was made at a finger point. But thankfully, I would have preferred that choice, because it comes down to, used to ask myself, who, if I was dealing with people or defendants or criminals or intelligence relating to certain individuals, I'd ask myself, do I want that person living in the same street as me? And if the answer was no, then the general public would likely think that as well. I didn't grow up in a glass bubble. I don't live in a glass bubble. I'm aware how communities work, and not everybody's perfect. But if people are hell-bent in causing misery, I was more focused into bringing some sort of justice to that person. And I feel those that are involved in drugs, whilst not everybody is a bad person, it's not cowboys and Indians, and it's not a them and us mentality is what I promote to new police officers. There's a hefty percentage that are probably not the best citizens in the local area. So I had a bit of a focus into helping that situation out.
It's interesting how little scenarios like that though do completely steer in a different direction. You have like a few throughout your lifetime, don't you, that like ping you in different directions of like, oh, I didn't realize that was a option as well.
It is. I mean, I go one step further because back then it was all crack and heroin, crack cocaine, heroin, and supply, urban street gangs, tit for tat gang violence. That took up a lot of my time. I got an interest in cannabis farms, and what I used to really love was having a snoop about cannabis grows. I don't know why. A lot of people hated cannabis farms. A lot of police officers hate them. Your clothes stink. You go in, you get mucky. You come out and you're chasing people around in rooms full of plants everywhere. So wires hanging down from the ceiling. And all that. I used to really enjoy it. It was time consuming. Supervisors hated it because it would take you out for the entire shift. But I used to love it because you'd go around in particular areas in central Birmingham when I tutored new police officers. No intelligence, no prior knowledge. We would literally just go out and follow a smell. And we'd go, right, there's a lot of cannabis grows. We both know in inner cities, there's one in every 2 streets that you happen to walk down. We'd literally follow our nose and then eventually take you into a small street, do some inquiries, knock on a few doors, and without a warrant, without any pre-enforcement intelligence, we'd find a cannabis crop. And I really enjoyed that time in my life when I was able to do so. So I got me a bit of an interest in cannabis. And then as the years progressed, I happened to find myself one day at the Hemp and CBD Expo in Birmingham.
What a transition, yeah.
I just went there as I progressed my career and got more in drugs. I think I was a drug expert at this point. And I thought, since 2018, this has came about. Let's go and see what CBD is all about. There was this massive hype. So I went there and then it just kind of trickled. And then I started working with a few organizations involved in the medicinal cannabis market as a police officer, just giving a bit of advice when I could.
The sort of transition of, hey, evil drug, catch all those criminals, to actually not these ones are okay, this one's medical. It's like, whoa.
Yeah, that's it. It's I mean, I think I was speaking to a journalist before and he kind of put it under this gamekeeper turned poacher scenario. Which it isn't, it's if someone's guilty of a crime, there's nothing I can do that it's going to help the situation. I help cannabis patients with prescriptions who are, perhaps dual sourcing, which I think we'll probably come on to at some point. But yeah, as a drug expert, you're there for the court. We can't make new evidence up. It's not possible. But what we can do is perhaps bring the court's attention to certain key aspects of the case that could be beneficial to the defence or even beneficial to the prosecution. I do about 60% prosecution work when I assist police forces who maybe have a backlog or have some certain complex cases that would like my assistance in. And then 40% when I get contacted by soliciting firms to help defendants who have been caught up in a case.
So maybe a good time to ask you, Gaz, about some good practices that patients could implement so that they don't become one of those unfortunate cases that come across the desk. We've alluded to it for a little while. I think sounds like the perfect timing. So where should they start?
Yeah, I would say that if I was to write down a responsible use guideline, which I have done for a couple of clinics. I don't know if they use them. They probably don't. It's probably riddled with spelling mistakes. But if I was to write down, I would say that a general maximum that patients get prescribed is about the 30-gram mark for a monthly supply. Now, if you were prescribed 30 grams of cannabis flower, my advice, first and foremost, is not to travel around with 30 grams of cannabis flower. I see no need, benefit, or purpose in traveling to your local Sainsbury's and then hanging around the streets or driving to your mates back and forward with an entire month's worth of medication. It's legally prescribed, but there's no reason to do so. If you were staying overnight or even over 2 nights, then you could take some with you. I get that. But if I was to be prescribed a month's worth of cocodamol from a doctor, I'm not walking around with 100 tablets in my back pocket.
Yeah, yeah.
And apply that same principle to CBPMs. That is, unfortunately, I wouldn't say common, but it's certainly one that I've seen a fair few times where patients have been caught up because they're driving around with all of their monthly cannabis in the car. And yes, I know that there'll be people who happen to watch this video as it goes out that will be screaming, but they're allowed to do so. They're patients. I get that. And they are operating within the confines of the law. But why would you do needless acts that may inadvertently confuse a police officer into assuming that you are part of a drug supply entity? It's needless, and I think it can be easily avoided. So that's one. Don't travel around with a month's worth of medicine. Number two, use a vaporizer. Many clinics now give it with the prescription. There's some clinics out there. I know Relief offer a vaporizer. LVL offer a very good vaporizer that I've actually used when I do police training. I take it with me to show police officers this is a very fancy vaporizer. This is how it works, and it's a fantastic little device. Vaporizers don't completely get rid of the smell, but a fair whack of it, so it does benefit. So I would say use a vaporizer. Be kind to your neighbours. So the waft of cannabis isn't going to be coming from your house as you consume your medicine. And I suppose the other aspect of it would be storage in a safe location. If you're prescribed Oromorph or diazepam or zopiclone or any benzodiazepine, keep it in a nice medicine cupboard along with other items. There's no reason for cannabis to be split down and kept in 5 different locations of your household. Because again, ask yourself, is this what a drug dealer does? And if the answer is yes, then probably don't do that.
I've made a few notes there, Gaz, as you were speaking, because I think you touched great points. I think here's what I've written: don't give the police a reason to investigate you. Like you were saying, the needless interactions of like, oh well, hey, or going and like instigating an interaction, because then you're basically giving the police a reason to go, well, okay, what? Inquire further. No, you're sort of like opening up you're testing it and playing the game then almost, aren't you? Like the interaction.
Exactly, and that's a great point, Chris, because look, I wouldn't want police grabbing hold of my phone. Not that there's anything wrong in it, but it's personal.
Invasive, no, sure.
And it's invasive. Yeah, exactly. And I do know people who have been, I wouldn't say incorrectly arrested. They've been arrested, justifiably arrested, but with no case to answer. There was no investigation. However, police had seized the phone. And then from the phone, it opened up a world into new investigations, new crimes that they have been investigating. For. So it's avoidable. And if you do happen to, create these situations where police can go through the phone, unfortunately nowadays they will go through the phone. And if they're going to go through it and find things, then you run the risk of other investigations.
Yeah, I was thinking dreadful, like what a rabbit hole you open up then with that. Vapes as well. I just want to say that to anyone watching this, smoking for medicinal purposes, crude and effective, sure, but in terms of health and just general promotion of getting the actual medicinal benefits of cannabis into your body for maximum medicinal value, it's got to be one of the worst. In that sense, you'll get the immediate relief, but chronically and long term, you're doing far more, I would say, harm than good. Although better than probably tobacco, it still nullifies a lot of the medical argument and doesn't go back to what you're saying about differentiating yourself from recreational consumption. It is the crudest, oldest way of consuming, sure, medically acceptable, but also in terms of public acceptance, but also medical efficacy, utility, and legitimacy, completely the opposite of what the whole medicinal process was designed for in the first place. So
exactly, and that's it. That's the point to make, is that when in 2018, when these changes were brought in, it was brought in on the back of vaporized consumption. It wasn't brought in on the back of, you can have the option, and if you want to roll a spliff, you know, because like you said, it's counterproductive. It's a whole other argument with the tobacco, but it's avoidable by you.
Yeah.
And a lot of people that I've been speaking to don't like the vaporizers. I think a lot of drug consumers are ritualistic. The creatures of habit.
Yeah.
So they miss that. I mean, I did the same from, you know, when I smoked tobacco to vapes, to then back to tobacco, and you miss the processes involved in having a cigarette compared to vaping, and then you get vaping, then go back to So I think it's just the habits.
Then the third one, Gaz, the storage. Do you find, well, say firstly from like for the kids' public health perspective, that's one of the main issues with, say, emergencies and cannabis, is kids accidentally getting access to it, whether it be edibles, consumables in whatever form. Kids are going to put something in the mouth, whatever it is, for the most part, if it's like we do for bleach. But have you seen, because I've heard like patients report this to me, where you obviously see a lot of patients demonstrating their medicinal prescription online now, talking about strains and reviews. Have you seen instances where obviously that's putting some of those patients at risk of burglaries or assaults, or sort of, or it'd be no more so than usual sort of online?
I would say no more than usual. I think the thing to remember, and I was going to bring it up when the opening came, that the differences with illicit, the quality differences with illicit cannabis and a GMP MHRA approved cannabis, produced facility. I'd go on record and say that I've seen some often better quality cannabis growing out of a spare bedroom in a 2-bedroom semi than I have that's come out of a GMP facility. So in terms of the quality difference, there's no reason for them to commit that offence. And cannabis is everywhere. If somebody was that desperate for it, and they didn't want to pay the £10 per gram, they could get it probably easier means. So thankfully, no, I've not seen any like burglaries or thefts as such of medicinal.
Which is nice to hear, honestly, because I sometimes think that from maybe cannabis naive patients as well, they're like, oh, well, I don't want drugs in the house because that then makes me a target, and be very risk averse. So touching on the different types of cannabis then, Gaz, and sort of moving towards some of my final questions for you. Dual sourcing. I don't know if you want to outline that for people, and maybe some of the, again, this is where the laws don't exactly, the binary black and white laws aren't necessarily reflected in reality and what humans will do to adapt, let's say.
So
what's going on there?
When two worlds collide. So dual sourcing. Like we both know, the medicinal cannabis is not cheap. And it's certainly not on a level playing field in terms of valuation and quality compared to the illicit market. So a 30-gram legal prescription of medicinal cannabis, let's say a rough average price of £250 to £300. Some clinics will do it slightly dearer, some maybe even do it slightly less, but £250 to £300. Compare that to a 1-ounce deal that you would buy from Jimmy down the road, who grows pretty good cannabis. He's been doing it a long time, as Jimmy. An ounce of cannabis, depending on where you are in the UK, will range from £160 to £200. So we see there's not a million miles of difference, but it's a considerable percentage. And if you're having to apply that every single month, I can understand why. People who are eligible for medicinal cannabis will source, or I can understand why people dual source. So dual sourcing would be, you apply for the consultation, you go through the quite streamlined rigmarole of getting a valid legal cannabis prescription, and rather than paying for a full 30 grams every month, you have a slightly mediocre amount so that you can pay, you can afford it. It might be 100, maybe 150, but you have a legal source of cannabis. Dual sourcing is when you happen to still use Jimmy down the road because he's a bit cheaper, and then you top up your legal supply. What I find is that a lot of patients will use the same container so that it's got that legitimate label or prescription on it, and they're saving some money. So I can understand the logic behind it. I can understand why people do so. You are getting two different strains, two different types of cannabis, but dual sourcing is common. And I'd say that it's on numerous occasions, it's brought some people to the courtroom. Not for simple possession. And unfortunately, in most situations that have been to that extent have involved a small element of supply as well.
Then again, I just find it interesting, like the levels of, okay, once that door's open, then it opens up another few of these doors. Once you sort of like step in the doo-doo, so to speak, you open up more lines of inquiry potentially as to, well, look, why do you have that, or what's going on there? And it just becomes like a, don't even make the question have to be asked in the first place. And and then maybe a bit of a semi-closing thought. So I've got some couple of quick fire ones to throw at you guys. If there was something that you would say, well, I guess speaking at large, this is technically a police training somewhat in a way. What should police know about patients in these cases? In your opinion, what do you think is missing from their understanding of some of these police interactions? Is it quite general, or have you got a message for the police of Britain that
I would say
help them in these situations?
So I think when I do engage in police training for this topic, the first thing that I say is, look, take the police hat off. And let's look at why people are consuming cannabis via a prescription. So it really gets into patient bios, and understanding that a lot of people who happen to be going down the prescription market, they're working people. They're accountants, in some situations, teachers. They've got respectable traded jobs that are very important to society. So it's putting the person in front of the drug as opposed to the drug in front of the person. So I try and humanize the drug consumption first and foremost. And then really go to town on differentiating the illicit market to the medicinal market. People sourcing these drugs have spent X amount of pounds. So when police officers are engaging, it's to not look at them as potential criminals. It's to look at them as just another patient who may have been prescribed diamorphine or Oromorph or diazepam or zopiclone or whatever. There's no difference. The reasoning behind it might be different and the drug itself is different, but it's still a prescribed drug. So with police, it's just not to complicate it with getting them bulked down with legislation, but just to understand that it's not your typical recreational cannabis smoker. It's might be the same drug, but it's two completely different situations.
Yeah. Quick transition then to maybe your thoughts on some of these harm reduction consumption zones / consumption rooms, cannabis clubs. What role do you see those playing? 'Cause I'm a big advocate, I suppose, so to speak. I say advocate in the sense of I think it can be done sensibly. I think there's a based approach there. But what issues do you maybe see with those? And do you see a way in that they could sort of be unfolded as a sort of a neutral intervention in some way, as a bit of an amnesty zone, so to speak?
Yeah. I mean, I'll be honest, Chris, I've had many a conversation with people thinking, wouldn't it be a great money-making idea to open up a really good... But yeah, so I speak about cannabis clubs quite a lot, actually, and I'm due to go and see one, I'd say within 15 miles of where I live. So it's on my to-do list for this month to go and pop my head in. So cannabis clubs, when you look at them, first of all, look at the ones that have opened up worldwide. So I've recently done a bit of research into cannabis clubs in Spain. There's over 500 cannabis clubs in Spain since they kind of opened the doors to legislation. And whilst they are very lucrative, they're tax generating businesses, they can be very good. But so far, my understanding of it in Spain is that they've been a bit of an attraction for quite a lot of organised crime.
Yeah.
So we have Barcelona has got them on the length and breadth, but feedback has been that there's foreign-based organised crime groups that are infiltrating cafes. They're forcing them to grow stock and then take it out the back door. Yeah. Excuse me. There's extortion rackets that have popped up in operation. So whilst it's been beneficial to the cannabis market, I feel it's came at a cost. And it has the question, I suppose, is ethically, does the benefit outweigh the negatives that come with it? I mean, there was an article just last week in the Costa Blanca region of Spain, and it was a British organised crime group, a couple of lads from the northwest that were over there, and with semi-automatic machine guns to assault the owner, kidnap, extortion, take the business. And I'm thinking, this is quite heavy stuff, and it's a cannabis. Thankfully, we won't get it to that extent in the UK, but the blueprint does show that it comes at a cost. It's not a utopian scenario. It's not the perfect answer, but I do feel they can work. And I think it just has to be regulated. It has to be monitored, and it can't be a free for all. In the UK, we've seen I occasionally get a phone call or an email from a licensing officer saying we've had an application to open up a cannabis consumption room. He says it's legal. Can I just double check? And I think, well, yeah, if it's for patients, but in all likelihoods, that club's not going to get full of cannabis patients. Because although it's growing rapidly, the overall volume of legitimate cannabis patients in the UK just isn't there to support revenue yielding cannabis clubs. So there's a lot of them that are sustainable based on the back of recreational use. But I still think they can operate as long as they do so in I suppose we could say a caring manner. So if they're going to operate and be a high for antisocial behaviour, police will shut
not
them
worth
down.
it, yeah.
And I completely support the shutting down of them. But if they're going to operate, allowing recreational and the very, caring and supportive of the neighbouring community, keeping things all locked up nice and tight, and it's respectable to its surroundings, then fantastic. It gives I suppose you could call it a safe place for people to go and socialise and not bother anybody. So I think there is a market, Chris, and I do see them opening up more and more often, but I do see some closing down as well because they're not sustainable financially.
Yeah, totally. I think a lot of people underestimate, how much effort it is to. At the end of the day, you've got to run a business legitimately if you want to do one in the UK. And a lot of people, obviously, like you were saying, not all of them are necessarily running legitimately and have other sources of income perhaps that are going on there. And I think that's, again, a bit of a word of caution for patients. Not all of these are there for you or to the benefit of you. It's oftentimes it's another, it's almost like a cloak that's being worn to and shapeshift and deceive.
No, definitely.
To wiggle the way in, which I get, but also at the same time, as you're saying, you don't want to be the wrong people. It's how those are really organized and who's leading them, and is it in the benefit / interest of the community it's meant to serve as well.
Exactly. And it's a shame because I think there's a lot that were set up with good intentions, but then they quickly realize that the volume just isn't there. I may be missing something because there are clinics with a very large client base, but they're so spread out. And yes, a lot of people enjoy consuming cannabis socially, but that's not everybody. People with chronic pain conditions just want to take their medicine and get on with the day and contribute to society, get their work done, come back to their kids and get some dinner and just live a normal life. Not everybody wants to sit in a social surrounding and, engage with like-minded individuals. Fair play if that's the thing, but I don't feel a business financially is going to be that supported at this moment in the UK. Good luck to those who are setting up. And there's some that do operate with full support of the local police force, which is fantastic because they've got that engagement, which I'd strongly recommend, unless they want, the door put in at 3 in the afternoon.
We can find out.
A van full of police officers.
No.
So yeah, cannabis clubs is an interesting one. I do use a Spain kind of situation. Yeah, it's a different society, different environment, but it's not a great situation there at the moment with them. I think there might be some changes because of the level of violence that's kind of getting seen within that environment.
And a final thought, Gaz, I've just sort of sprung to my mind there is another option. Home grow.
Yeah.
Just something that people can do and we don't need any regulations, and hopefully just do it in smart, safe ways. Again, with the same, if we don't make the same mistakes as we did with the last policy change where there's no how-to guidelines, I think if we do the opposite of what we usually do, which is just spray and pray, hope for the best, with a nice set of guidelines and guidance and outline in a booklet, and maybe you have to apply for a license like you do for, I don't know, a smoke alarm or something.
Yeah.
Something sensible also I see as a potential option.
Do you know, I think
you sort of stand on that, Gaz?
The blueprint that you just mentioned, I think sounds great. If people, it's a big if people follow
exactly that too.
But do you know what, Chris? I think what I find with the British public, we're a little different to a lot of countries, where I think the saying of you give it an inch, you'll take a mile. I'm convinced it was made for the British public because there's a lot that I think if they're allowed to do something, there'll be a lot of people that will want to take that allowance, magnify it by 10, and really
to the farm.
Yeah. So I think the first main point is not to look at those who will be growing for financial gain, but look at the safety element. So I've been to several house fires that have went up through dodgy electrics from cannabis cultivation, and there's various practices that different cultures and backgrounds will apply to bypass the electricity. If someone's growing, let's say in theory the government allows 4 plants, say right, you're allowed to grow 4 plants. The price of electricity, I mean, I'm nearly 300 quid a month and I've only got a 3-bedroom house, and if I was to grow 4 plants, that's going up. I think people will look to save on their electricity costs, and very quickly will create a demand for in the know-how semi-qualified tradesmen to go around and fulfill your requirements electricity wise. So you'll have this partially trained, I know what to do type guy who'll turn up for a couple of £100 and sort your electrics out. I think we'll be bringing that tradesman to the mass. I think they'll, Johnny, who spent a year at electricity college, will be earning a lot of money going round. So I think that there is going to be an element of that. We will be bringing that risk of fire and property damage to place. And also, if they live in a flat, will we allow it if they live in a flat? Because if a flat goes up, we've seen it in the UK, unfortunately. So I think the restrictions would have to be a house. It would have to be a bought house, because you're bringing risk to someone else's property. In doing so, by making it a bought house, are you restricting it through economic factors? Are we penalising those who didn't have the financial means to buy a house? That's a whole other argument. So I think it gets a little bit complicated. You think, right, now we've got a property, has to be a bought property, has to be under 4 plants. Will they convert the electrics? Ooh, we don't know. So you're right, they would probably have to get, like you suggested, a certificate.
Seriously thought through.
Yeah, so I don't think it can work in the UK. I think, or if it does, there would be some some very, very detailed requirements to do so. I mean, the Home Office give licenses for hemp production and for cannabis production under certain circumstances. Perhaps it's another bow to their string where you can have a social consumption cannabis license, and they would come out, you would have to pay them, they would inspect the venue, inspect the room. Maybe that could be something that could work going forward, but I think there'll be a lot of people that would try and take advantage.
Oh, guaranteed. No, for sure. Thank you, guys. Bit of a conclusion then for people that would like to get in touch with you guys. We'll put your details all around the video, but who particularly should get in touch with you, and how can you help them?
So there's a couple of different ways how we can help people. So excuse me.
And we should plug Claymore Advisories in there, Gaz, as well as your to clarify.
Smashing. So the website is claymoreadvisorygroup.co.uk, and there's contact details on there, or you can contact on LinkedIn, Gaz Carroll, and all our contact details are there. The way we can benefit a medicinal cannabis patient is in the unfortunate circumstance if they happen to have come in contact with the law. If there's a police investigation, whether it's personal use, whether it's personal possession or supply investigations, we can help inform the court of how the medicinal cannabis world works, how the cost implications of a private prescription can impact people's sourcing of cannabis. We can challenge police interpretations of mobile phones. Chris, I go through 2 or 3 mobile phones a week, and my eyes go square because I'm reading that many text messages. So I do a lot of data interpretation work. So we assist patients and clients by going through the mobile phones that have been done so by the police force. And we can challenge, agree, or disagree with evidence that's been brought to the table. Interestingly, today, I've had an inquiry for a landlord whose property was getting used to cultivate cannabis. And he's taken a private challenge to the rental agents and insurance company. And I am potentially assisting him in a report detailing how long the cannabis crop was potentially in situation, the damage that it can cause, and then highlighting just how common it is for rental agents, crooked officials to get involved in this domestic cultivation scene. So he was a genuine victim, and those who used his property all ran away.
Mortified, wouldn't you?
They left him a £20,000-30,000 repair bill, and I think the insurance companies get a bit strict on paying such bills. So I'm helping someone in that situation, really, hopefully, in a private prosecution matter. So the way I say it, if you do have any legal proceedings, it doesn't cost anything to reach out. Most services are legal aid funded as well. So I think in 99% of occasions, the client doesn't actually have to pay anything. We go through the legal aid authority if they qualify, of course. Just like they do get free and independent legal advice, they can also get a free and independent drug expert witness, such as myself. And then we can hopefully assist matters and stop it getting to court, or if it does get to court, put across the best possible evidence.
Boom. Thank you, guys. Absolutely super. I say thank you for your service to the police force, Gaz, and for dealing with all the terrible things you have to deal with. And thank you to all the other potential law enforcement viewers that are
thanks very much
sticking along, and any emergency services for all the work you do. Thank you, Gaz, for continuing service and crime prevention in the cannabis sector. Anyone that wants to get in touch with you, we'll make sure to signpost them through the community. Thank you again for taking the time to have a sit down with me, Gaz, and go through and turn over all the discussions that are going on in cannabis at the moment, and for contributing your unique perspective. So
thanks so much for having me.